We're very fortunate to have Michael Turback with us this evening, who has written several books, including the Ithaca Farmer's Cookbook, which he generously donated copies to us, and they're for sale. If you'd like to buy a copy tonight, they're on sale for $19.99. If you want to give us $20, we'll take the extra penny. And maybe Michael will even sign it for you. Christina also has put together some recipes from our archives, so we hope you'll pick up a sheet of interesting recipes from the archives, and I know some of you have been reading other recipes as they've been going through the slideshow here. So Michael is going to give an informal talk on a history of eating local, and we really appreciate your being with us this evening, Michael. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. How are you? My topic is local food, one of my favorite things to talk about. It's a topic that can go in a lot of different directions. So maybe you can help me out. I'll talk a bit about some local and regional history. I'll talk about some of my own personal and business history. The term local food movement is kind of a new, trendy term, but eating locally is something that's not new at all. The original inhabitants of this region, the tribes of the Iroquois Nation, had thriving villages and abundant farms here and up and down the lakes. They ate very well from the things they grew. They made one big mistake. During the Revolutionary War, they sided with the British, and I think George Washington must have taken it personally, because he sent John Sullivan and his troops to drive the natives out of this region. They scattered, as they scattered across the Midwest, the troops burned their villages to the ground and destroyed their orchards and fields. So what happens next was the new country divided the land up into military tracts and awarded those properties to volunteers who had fought for independence. And they and their families moved to the region, and I want to just read a little bit about what happens next in an introduction to the Farmer's Market book. Early settlers to the region took advantage of the glacially derived nutrient-rich soils, and by the early 19th century, hundreds of productive farmsteads surrounded Ithaca. With the moderating effect of the deep lakes, farmers were able to harvest bumper crops of produce not otherwise expected to prosper this far north. Corn was raised to feed family and livestock. Orchards of apples and peaches were planted. Many farms had vineyards with rows of grapevines. While most crops were cultivated for subsistence, excess produce was carried into the city, displayed around the old courthouse, and offered for sale or barter. It was a time when local farmers grew local food for local folks. Yet, the march of progress is in quotes, would take another course. The completion of the Cayuga Seneca Canal in 1828, connecting the lakes to the Erie Canal, opened the way for trade outside the region and brought about a change in agriculture and a change in eating patterns. Steamboat landing became a transportation hub as commercial steamboats collected produce from growers and transferred cargo to scows and railroad cars for delivery to cities throughout the Northwest. So as the country grew, the need for bigger farms and more productive farms grew. And over that period of a century or century and a half, commercial agriculture dominated. And it wasn't really until the 1960s when they're experienced any sort of rebirth in any serious way of the small family farm. That was a time when younger people who maybe had no previous experience on a farm, never even grew up on a farm, but somehow found themselves with a calling to do something other than go to work in an office, bought some land or rented some land and began growing. Those farmers needed a way to sell, so they formed farmers markets. And our own farmers market was established in 1973 and has actually grown to become one of the more influential farmers markets in the region. As I was working on the book, I learned that people come from all over the country to take a look at what we do here with our farmers market, and they go back. They sometimes copy the identical, there are identical buildings because it's such an effective way to sell. Of course, I had the privilege of developing this book for the farmers market, and went on to do a book very similar to that, very similar to this book for the North Market in Columbus, Ohio, which is a historic public market, and helped develop a cookbook for the Findlay Market in Cincinnati. Both of those projects because of the influence of the Ithaca Farmers Market. So how does one get to be the person who writes farmers market cookbooks? I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up on the Jersey Shore, about 20 minutes from New York City. And my family was in the restaurant business, so I grew up around food, and came to Cornell as a 17-year-old freshman in 1962. Studied restaurant management at the hotel school, and spent a year after graduation working for a small restaurant chain in Honolulu. Came back and came to Ithaca, and with a loan from my parents opened a restaurant just a little south of downtown. And for 10 years, for nearly 10 years, first 10 years of that operation, Turback's was a typical American restaurant. Typical American menu, wine list of mostly California and French wines, the way most American restaurants did in those days. An interesting event happened in the state in the late 70s, the passage of the Farm Winery Bill, and first allowed local grape growers to produce their own wines. And I had the pleasure of meeting some of the pioneers who would bring their wines to the restaurant. People like Dr. Constantine Frank and Bill Wagner and Peter Johnstone from Heron Hill, Ray Spencer from Glenora. Those were the early people who brought their wines, and I put the wines on the menu, the ones I liked. They weren't all great. And the part of the story that my wife likes me to tell was that I was out in San Francisco to run a marathon, and then spent a couple of days in Napa Valley. And this was just at probably right at the late 70s. It was maybe 79 or 1979 or 1980. We had just a handful of local wines on the list. But I spent time sipping wines for a couple of days in Napa and realized that the restaurants, when you opened their wine list, they were just Napa Valley wines. And I can remember making a note to myself on the plane ride home that if the Finger Lakes became a serious wine region, maybe an all New York State wine list would be appropriate. And it wasn't soon after that I decided to sell off the California and European wines and stock only New York State wines. A year or two later, I was out in Seattle and had dinner at the restaurant at the top of the Space Needle. And on their menu, on their food menu, they listed the farms that the main ingredients of the dishes came from. And on the plane ride home, it occurred to me that I was already invested in the concept of local wines, and so why not match that with as many local foods as I could find. And that's sort of the story of a restaurant that built its reputation on local food and local wine. At first, people thought I was a little crazy. And then after a while, when I started getting lots of serious people writing about this little restaurant in Ithaca, it sort of proved to be very valuable. Now, you must remember that, of course, in those days, I would send my chef down to the farmer's market. But the farmer's market was just a handful of people at that time. So we had to find people. We had to look for products. I can remember a fellow named Gene Shepker who grew garlic. And I can remember John Bloomer who raised lamb. And it's been a long time now. I've been out of the restaurant business for a while, but we had so much fun doing something that nobody else was doing at the time. And were rewarded for it. People found it interesting, and the restaurant, of course, was successful. We were sort of flying by the seat of our pants. We didn't really, I thought it was a good idea. At first, we didn't know how to promote it, so we were not really quite upfront about it. But once we thought we had enough New York food and wine. New York, everything was food and wine. New York food and wine. And so I copied the idea that I stole from the Seattle. We would always put the names of the farms that we bought things from. And not only did we get a lot of press, but people found it interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I would send my chef down to the farmer's market on Saturdays, and so we would have weekend specials that were very local and fresh, something very, very fresh. And we heard early on from the vendors at the market that we were raising consciousness about things that were grown local. And although the wines were from all over the state, the food was pretty much local, and it was I think people found it very interesting. Now, we were doing that here, but somehow in California the food trends very often have historically begun. So people like Alice Waters had already based her reputation on local food and buying from small farmers. So we didn't really do something completely new, but we sort of did it. It was new to New York, and it was new to the East Coast, really. We had articles written about us by practically, I have a scrapbook of practically every major food or food and wine magazine, and every Wine Spectator did an editorial about our little restaurant. one of my favorite, let's see if I can remember this, there was a quote from the Los Angeles Times, which was interesting that a California newspaper was writing about us. But their quote was, it was the first East Coast restaurant to take their local food and wine seriously. So that was sort of a badge of honor for us. Even during the growing season, we would put something on the menu, and the producers, they couldn't keep up with what we would use. So we didn't say we never said that we were 100% local. So, there were, we could do, we began reaching out beyond local. We would buy Long Island ducks. We were buying Hudson Valley potatoes. So we began, but we stayed within New York. We tried to buy, I've always admired the concept of the farmer's market being, having that 30-mile, I mean, you have to be within 30 miles of the market to be able to sell there. And that geographical, the idea of geography, the idea of buying something that's grown in your own backyard, I think is so important. And it's sort of comes full circle, because that's the way it was in the earliest days, in the days of the Native Americans, and in the days of the early settlers, early white settlers. To tell you the truth, I think one of the reasons that I grabbed that idea is that I expected that everybody's going to do it. So I want to be the first one to do it, because I want to be the first one. But to this day, I'm surprised at how little attention is paid by our Finger Lakes restaurants. Now, there are some in Ithaca and in other places I mean, there are some, well, if you just take Ithaca, I know Just a Taste does really, they buy, and they don't make too big of a deal, but they buy heavily locally by a lot of farmers. They have Stick and Stone in there every other day, and of course Cultivare opened with the idea of pretty much the same idea that we had, that they would have as much, they would concentrate as much, but not everybody gets it. I don't understand what, I'm not saying that everybody should do exactly what we did, but I'm surprised that, because I expected that the Finger Lakes, I had an idea that this was going to be a serious wine country, and it has become serious wine country. And that people would come here from all over, and they do come here for all over. And they come here to try the wines, and they should be it seems natural to eat the food and wine. But I don't want to particularly criticize anybody, but I'm disappointed that there are not more places that get it. I sold the restaurant in 1997, and because I had an opportunity to sell it, and without exactly knowing what I wanted to do. But I had without telling a long story, I met a literary agent over lunch with a friend who suggested that now that I ran a restaurant for nearly 30 years, that I should write a book about running a restaurant for nearly 30 years. And fresh out of the restaurant experience, I thought, that's like the last thing that I want to do. But I did want to write something. And it's interesting that we're here talking about this at the History Center, because one of my favorite things about Ithaca history, it was the birthplace of the ice cream sundae. And I suggested to the literary agent that no one has ever written a book just about the ice cream sundae. It's probably been in hundreds, there have probably been recipes for sundaes in hundreds of cookbooks, but nobody's done the book. And that's really how I started writing. I wrote a book called A Month of Sundays. She found a publisher from New York City who published the book. And that was quite an experience. I ended up making Sundays with Jane Clayson in front of the Plaza Hotel in New York on national TV, and with Charles Grodin on 60 Minutes 2. Yeah, there used to be a 60 Minutes 2. There isn't anymore. But it's interesting that having written one book, you sort of break the ice, and so you have opportunities to do other things. And I wrote a book called Greetings from the Finger Lakes. That was the first serious book about food and wine, sort of an update. That was 2005, I think. And that was a great background for writing the farmer's market book, because they wanted when the farmer's market people approached me about doing the book, they said, well, we want a cookbook. And I thought that with the background of writing a book about the Finger Lakes, I found the people who were making wine, the people who were growing the things we're eating, I found those people so interesting that I thought that they should become part of the book. So recipes it's a cookbook, and it's a book of recipes, but it's also a book about the people. And I think as many of you indicated, you go regularly to the farmer's market, the idea of, well, you might have favorite things to buy, but you don't know that much about the people who are selling them to you. Well, read the stories about them in the book, because they're fascinating. They all have fascinating stories. Some have been farmers for generations, have been farming families for generations, and others gave up fascinating careers in something completely different and decided to become a farmer.